Welcome to TFT Academy, your source on how to play all the top comps in the meta. This first episode, we're going to cover Korean EDM Lux. We're going to break down the core game plan and all different items, augments, and core units you want to play around on your way to victory. And then afterwards, we're going to watch a game to show how it's done. So let's get straight into it. This build first surfaced in popularity through Korea because one player one-tricked it to Challenger on the Korean server. This is a post on the Chinese website NGA, and I just thought it was really fun. The title of this comp guide in Chinese translated, which is Waifu Black Technology, 4 Buckets of Lux. I thought that was really funny. Let's go ahead and get into what makes this comp good. So why play EDM Lux in the first place? Well, one, I think Lux has some pretty good matchups currently in the metagame. A lot of people are playing things like Disco, which tends to line up very cleanly if you're on the correct side with Lux. So then you instantly kill things like Twisted Fate and their Nami and their Ziggs really quickly. And then there's other people that are just playing backline carries a lot of times, like a Karthus or a Vex or Ari. Sometimes you end up just killing things like Ezreal really quickly as well. And even 2-star Lux can put out a ton of damage early game. The second reason is that Lux is pretty uncontested. You only really need Lux 3 to have his comp be playable, although you do want to chase other 3-stars. And no one is really playing Lux outside of those odd disco lines that want to get a lot of dazzers going. And even then, it's usually temporary. The third reason is that it's a comp that you can play when you get a lot of rods, which I think a lot of people struggle with because they feel like they have to play something like Karthus and Twisted Fate Disco if they get a lot of rods. It's also another out you can play for if you are trying to angle for Vex by having a lot of rods and then want to pivot out of it. Last but not least, it's one of the most fun comps to play in the game because you just shoot a lot of lasers and you pew pew and you delete carries really quickly and you get to grief everyone's positioning. And unless they have something like a Lowy, they're just going to have a difficult time in the late game. That being said, it does have some drawbacks. One, if you don't hit Lux 3, you can struggle. And two, we did mention that Lowy is a counter unit. But to be fair, Lowy counters like a third of the entire roster. So you can't really be accounting for Lowy as a reason to not play something right now. Your core game plan is pretty straightforward. It's going to be a standard level 7 reroll. Standard level 7 reroll means you try to get to stage 4, level to 7, and then use your gold above 50 to slow roll until you hit 3 stars. Stage 2 and 3 is pretty straightforward. You're going to want to just play generic tempo line and focus on preserving HP and making your economy thresholds. So if you can find a way to win streak and make 10, 20, 30 cleanly, then you're in a great spot. In contrast, you don't really want to lose streak and play this composition, mainly because it's not really a win out comp like a Yone and a Riven, which they can hit with like 1 or 2 lives and then win out the rest of the game. Those kinds of level 7 rerolls are fast level 7 sometimes. You go to like 3-5 or you level a little bit quicker and then you try to roll very fast so you can stabilize because you lost so much HP. Instead, you try to play by killing as many units as possible by playing something like Disco early game or KDA Superfan early game, anything that can hold AP early. And then you have the option of rolling at 6 because there's a lot of 2s and 3 costs in your composition that we'll talk about in a little bit. When you are rolling at level 7, you want to make sure to try to aim for 2-star bruisers and Lux 2. Lux 2 ideally through a headliner. And then from that point on, you're going to want to try to position Lux to snipe other carries by being the opposite side. If Lux is on the same corner as the enemy carry, that can be problematic because they might not be the farthest distance, and then Lux is just going to deal less damage and take forever to kill them. There's a lot of other small nuances about what you can do with the comp, but I do want to shout out one other major game plan is you want to get ready to sample Jax 3 for the melee matchups in the very late stages of the game. Actually, I just wrote in here that it's Jax 3 because the star level does matter for when you sample. So make sure you're sampling Jax 3 for those melee matchups. If it's Jax 2 and you have a Lux 3, just stick with the Lux 3. And that is a bad matchup, so you have to be careful about that. In general, anything that closes the distance with melee carries can give Lux a hard time, so that is one reason why this comp isn't inherently S tier, but you know, again, it's an out for people to play for that you can hit very early and just cruise to an easy top 4. The top priority units to think about when you're playing this composition is Lux, Zac, Jax, and Set. These are the 4 units that if you 2-star, you can pretty much consider yourself stable. And remember, you're always trying to go for a headliner Lux if possible. Sometimes you're gonna have to settle and play like, you know, EDM Jax temporarily in the advanced form of this composition because you don't always get to hit that Lux and you want to stop rolling your gold pretty quickly. But assuming you do hit the headliner Lux, you end up playing for these units to be 2-starred. A lot of times you're gonna hit Zac 1, so try not to greed too hard, but if you do hit Zac 2, you're in a really good spot. The second priority are things like Gragas and Zed. Those are really nice units to have 2-star, but they're not super duper crucial compared to the other units. Zed in particular, if you get him 2-star, you can start itemizing him, give him random AD items, which could be very powerful. And that's usually what you do. If you're like, what do I do with my AD items? I get a bunch of, you know, swords and bows, and Luxus already has Giant Slayer. What do I do? Just give Zed items like that. And then the last would just be either Bruiser of, you know, Tom Kench, a Olaf, maybe you high roll in the Lowy, which is your third priority, but oftentimes you can't really bank on hitting that Lowy. And that third prio is based off of what ends up being really good for your specific spot. So if you end up hitting a Lowy, you you pretty much always play that Alawi because she's the strongest bruiser that you can also top end with. And every time you hit Ziggs, you play Ziggs because his shred is really powerful, and also he's a dazzler that combines with Lux. Speaking of dazzlers, you do have a couple packages that you could play, including things like Twist of Fate and Nami for like a disco Tekken. Disco would be less important to get max value on, so don't feel like you have to go for like the full greed disco. You pretty much just want Lux and like another carry to basically have that disco, maybe a bruiser, but make sure you still play like a generically good frontline setup, because if you clump so much for disco, you might make Lux a little bit weaker. Jazz is really good as top end, and your dazzler that can tie in is Bard. And then if you get Sona Lulu, you get Spellweavers in because it ties into Gragas as a Spellweaver. That's another way you can make your top end really, really powerful, and I would recommend going for the AP version of Sona in this spot. Let's go over some of the ideal augments that you can play for a comp like this and why. The first thing to think about is combat augments is what are really helping these real comps compete in the late game. If you end up taking too much economy or item resources, you're going to fall off late game and probably end up being more like third or fourth. If you are in a spot where you're hitting fast enough, the combat augments is what makes you top two in a lot of spots. Things like Vampirism is just generically really good right now. Like healing is particularly powerful because there's so many ways for people to access backline. If you see like Akali or Karthus or even Twist of Fate that just shoots cards past the front line, they'll just splash your unit down. And so having ways for Lux to heal herself is really, really good, which we'll also cover in the item section. And this also applies to anything like healing orbs and martyr. These are different ways for units to heal, which can be pretty good. In general, I do actually list like the best performing augments at the top, and then like the second and third rows are like, you know, pretty good augments that also make a lot of sense for different reasons. You can actually take one economy focused augment a lot of times because it helps you hit, and when you hit, this composition is equally as important as your items and your setup, because part of the reason what makes this comp really good is that you're trying to capitalize on tempo windows when Lux can basically one shot or two shot backliners very quickly. And if you are behind and Lux is taking 3 to 4 casts in order to kill, then you're not necessarily playing ahead and dominating them by being very aggressive on their backline. And so economy stuff like Spoils of War can be really good. March of Progress is one of the best prismatics for this very reason because it helps you reroll that. Items are actually kind of in the same bucket as economy. It just helps you get resources for your composition to get online. Things like Component Buffet is really good because you can just basically select all the rods you could possibly want. Rods in general are very, very good in this composition. And for that very reason, our Unleashed Arcana is actually very good because you just have 2 rod items immediately done on Lux, and you probably only need like 1 or 2 more. Radiant Relics is surprisingly very good because not only can you get like a really powerful Lux item, which honestly any of her Abyss items can turn into Radiance, but you can also go for a really good defensive item that can be very powerful to keep your frontline alive. Also because I think Radiant Spark is just like a really, really, really strong item right now. And so if you're able to get something like that, it solves your shred issues and you should be able to get a lot of tempo from it. And then the third kind of resource is something like a duplicator, which can be good. Heroic Grab Bag, I would say you should only take in a very desperate situation. And if you take stuff like this, you're playing more for like top 4. Pandora's is an augment that actually ends up being kind of solid because of the items situation. You don't really want a lot of like bows and you don't want that many swords. So having things more like rods and defensive items is really, really good. Some of the best defensive items are things that synergize with bruisers. Too Big to Fail ends up being actually one of the best augments you can play around this with because Lux really wants the bruiser frontline to sustain her so that she can just go for big bursts and shoot from the backline. Unsurprisingly, Keepers ends up being really good as well because if you end up playing like the Disco Core, you can actually have Lux you can play Disco Dazzlers with this at 8 and then have Keepers be like a nice way for you to get some defensive value. And don't sleep on Forge. Forge has some really good items for Lux because she is really good with Goldmancer, Zonias. DFT is acceptable, but in general, it's kind of like a weak item, as I said in the previous video. So when Deathfire Grasp gets buffed, because eventually it will be, units like Lux are going to really love that item. Other things that just kind of make sense intuitively based off of everything else I described. Magic Wand gives you rods. Learning Spell gives you AP. You just want a lot of AP for this composition because Lux doesn't have AP built into her trait. Stationary Support can be really good. It can give you things like Locket for frontline, which is really good, or Chalice, a Q-Cone for AP in the backline. Item grab bag could be something you take, and then as a result, you choose to play Lux because you're like, oh, you know, this item grab bag gave me like death cap, and now I have like more rods and tears and belts. Maybe I should just play like Lux. Also, early game is not to be ignored. So things like Silver Spoon helps preserve the HP. We kind of talked about how this is a standard level 7 and not a fast level 7 loose streak type of oriented reroll comp. So don't be afraid to take something that helps you get a little bit of boost economy early. I mean, this is basically like giving you 10 gold and then you can start making your economy while win streaking. It is potentially really, really good. That also applies to things like sleight of hand and roll of dice. These are like early game, high tempo, helps you win streak type of augments. And that's the main purpose of it. After you take stuff like this, make sure you take some combat augments. Speaking of like a weird combat augment, a lot of people actually theorize that hologram could be good in this composition where you get 2 3-star luxes. I don't know if that's actually true. The data says it's not very good, but I've had some people suggest that it's very good. So I don't know. Maybe it's one of those things where people take it and it's just like a skill issue, but I would be hesitant towards it because I'm not entirely sure if it's as good as some of these other prismatics. But the thing about prismatics is sometimes you can get really screwed with them because they're just not applicable for your spot whatsoever. And so in the worst case scenario, take something like hologram and see how it does. In these kinds of situations, hologram might actually even be better used as a frontline unit. But again, I have 0 games on this, so it's all just theory crafting for me. Item BIS for Lux is generally having a ton of AP. I mean like a lot, because EDM gives you a second cast and gives you frequency of the cast, and Dazzler gives you like that bonus damage. So you really want to have a high base number with ability power, just raw ability power, so that Lux can get a lot of damage. And the second thing would be healing, because right now it's just a backline access meta. So having a Gunblade to heal your frontline like a Zac could be really, really huge. And for those very reasons, if you do end up getting things like a Radiant Death Cap or Goldmancer, this is really powerful in Lux in particular. Heavily consider going for it. Plus, Goldmancer Lux is just awesome. It's just so funny to watch your entire opponent team get deleted and then 8 gold gets left behind. At the same time, don't let yourself get stuck with greeting too hard. 3-item Lux is really powerful, especially if you're able to get 3-star early. So don't be stuck on like 1.5 item Lux while you're trying to greed for BIS. Some flex items that you can play are like, Jewel Gauntlet, if you get that like prismatic augment, for example, or you just get a lot of gloves. Shows is like okay, it casts a lot lower. Honestly, a lot of times when I play things like Lux and I have Shojin on her, I try to remove that item in the late game and find a way to get that onto like a Sona, Ziggs, or somebody else, because it's probably better that way. Giant Slayer just as another form of bonus damage in case you're not able to hit like double AP items. Hodge is if you're going for like a Jewel Gauntlet build and trying to go for like maximum crits, you get like 100%. But it's a healing item, so it's like a more selfish one. Not really that big of a fan of it. I'd rather have Hodge go on like Zed, for example, or Jax if you get Jax to 3-star. Zac wants a bunch of health items and things that help make him a little bit tankier. But if you're able to get something like Steadfast Heart and Warmogs and Crown Guard, that's just like a lot of ways to capitalize on his bruiser trait. But in reality, you're just going to be trying to play like whatever frontline items you can get. So things like Bramble Warmogs is also good. Magic Resistant Shred is really important in the composition, but unlike Jax, Lux targets the backline. And so Spark can be kind of weird where it doesn't actually reach the backline, but at the same time, it's still a good item on Zac. And if you end up playing matchups where it matters with sampling Jax instead of Lux, you can instead go for like, the Jax build, and the Spark will have guaranteed value. But yeah, like, Vow, Adaptive Helm, like there's a bunch of different defense items you can put onto Zac and justify it. Just make sure you get 3 items Zac 2 and you're good to go. If you don't have Zac 2, you're just like stuck on Zac 1 while rolling, and you have like, 3-star Set or 3-star Gragas, you can just give them the tank items and then give Zac leftover. It's very interchangeable. And then if you get extra AP items, they go onto Jax, and leftover AD goes onto Zed, but you're never really going out of your way to play AD. But, Zed is reliable enough to deal damage, even though he's sampling Lux. In terms of positioning, there's 2 main defaults that you usually go for. This is kind of similar to what we have on the Mobilix tier list, where you have a Bruiser frontline and you have something like an extra Dazzler. In this case, it's Switch of Fate. Could be Ziggs, could be whoever you hit, maybe even have that Jazz set up. Lux in the corners tends to be really effective because she shoots top left from bottom right, and she shoots top right from bottom left. Just use your discretion based off your matchups. If you see, Twisted Fates and Disco clumping up a lot, or you see a lot of things that you can punish, like a Vex or a Karthus, just try to aim for that. The other option is to put her in the middle, because if you see a lot of things like a Kali and maybe even, something else that targets backline like another Lux, just put her in the center. And late game, this is actually something that you'll be doing a lot. If you somehow end up playing Disco and you get a Disco Ball, don't really greed Disco on anyone besides like the Lux and maybe like, one unit that kind of makes sense. So in this case, these are all the damage dealing units that might actually be able to survive and get healing, which could be really crucial. But your bruisers probably stay in the front line. And you want to use units like Nami to try to be like a sniper in the late game. So if you see like a Yone in the top left and Lux right here, you put like Nami here to make sure she targets like the Yone. This matters so much more than getting full disco value in the late game. Another positioning tactic that you can also use is to trap your melee units like Jax. Jax is very vulnerable. Even in the late game, if you get him to 3-star, he can actually die very quickly. So if you trap Jax in the back, it's actually kind of a real thing where Jax can shoot lasers. And based off the EDM timing, he is going to be able to transform into Lux and then shoot from the back. So you almost kind of have like, you know, a triple laser setup here. This is like really powerful in like matches like Disco, where you know everything's going to be positioned usually in a generic way. And the way people counter that, if you're going up against this, is to split your comp into like 2 sides of Disco. One disco ball here, one disco ball there, and then you just kind of like piece it apart. Don't use this all the time. It is very fun. It's actually kind of addicting. Once you realize you can get value off of Jax this way, a lot of people end up doing it for every fight, and that's wrong. Sometimes you actually kind of need that Jax to give yourself a little bit of distance for Lux. Actually, I kind of messed up. You want Lux down here because you don't want her to be in 3rd row and more vulnerable to a bunch of AoE. You could also go into the bottom left as well, but you kind of need something extra. So you can do something kind of like this, where you trap the Jax in with maybe a tentacle. And then you have TF Lux and a tentacle trying to shoot the top right. And this is probably going to be a little bit more common because this ends up being a position that's usually good into people who corner in the same way on the top right, because the top right gives you more hexes for disco. So you're probably going to do something like this. Let's go into a game example of how someone got into the Lux line. This is Subzeroark. He's another YouTuber who also does VOD reviews, by the way, and streams on Twitch. He is Frodan approved. So if you like my stuff, go check out some of his content as well. This is also going to be a little bit of a faster VOD review because it's to give you the sense of how to play the comp and not necessarily like, you know, walk through every single different step. It's not an In Too Deep series. He's playing around Emo, Annie 2, and Superfan early because he's just trying to kill units. He starts off with a gold opener, has 2 items instead of 3, so he's going to have a little bit more economy than usual. And he picks something like March of Progress because that helps you get into a 3-cost reroll very easily. March of Progress is usually for 2-cost and 3-cost rerolls. There's players like Cruel Pact in the lobby, so didn't really expect to win with this kind of stuff. So that's kind of why it's like difficult to try and tempo in prismatic lobbies. Just keep that in mind. You're unlikely to win streak because there's just a lot of high roll stuff like that. Picks up a KDA, just texts it in to try to make stronger his board. Again, just trying to kill units with this Annie, but he's not slamming Giant Slayer because Giant Slayer is pretty weak early compared to late game. Not a lot of units are above that HP threshold, and looks like we're going to get a win versus Loose Streak Twin Terror. On the carousel, ends up going for a tier. If you knew he was going to try to play Lux, then he probably would go for that rod because you want as many rods as you possibly can in this composition. But again, I don't think he necessarily was angling for it. And an example of this is how he discovered that he had a Lux angle. So he took tier for more versatility because Spellweavers traditionally want more tiers and mana generation than straight up AP. He does end up slamming a Giant Slayer in general though, which is actually kind of interesting. I think a lot of people actually saying Shojin. But I think that's just to keep his versatility because if he wants to save the tier for like a blue buff, it probably could work that way. And this last fight on stage 2 looks like he gets a nice 3 streaks. So that Giant Slayer ended up paying off, which is really nice. He sells the Annie here and decides to open because he is going to hit level 6 and maybe it's the opportunity to hit a 3-cost headliner because of March of Progress. And he'd rather play around something really more powerful like Lulu, for example, or even if he hits like Seraphine, that could be really strong. He has a Lux in his shop and a set, and he doesn't buy it because he's going to be focusing on making 50 gold. And immediately gets the EDM Lux with an Ari, which is actually kind of interesting because you could theoretically justify hedging both lines here and just playing around like Lux into Ari. But look at how he got dropped double rod, and now it's like one of those situations where a lot of people hear, hey, if you're playing Ari, you don't want things like Death Cap and Jewel Gauntlet on her because she has so much AP already. You want to give her like mana generating items like Blue Buff and Nashers. So this is something that Subzeroark says, wait, actually, maybe this is a spot where I can start thinking about Lux instead because of my itemization. In a lot of cases, people would be like greeting for things like a Spark and a Gunblade and try to like find ways to make rod items like that. Augments here, I think he could justify taking Cyberbulk or Buried Treasures, like either one of them is fine because you kind of want to have a little bit of combat power. But Buried Treasures is also fine because he doesn't really have like the full Lux setup and he probably feels like he just wants to get more items for his front line because he has no items for his front line. So I think that's fine. This is kind of going a little bit against what we say you want to have a bunch of combat augments, but I think his situation, you can justify things like Buried Treasures here. He could have actually also taken Radiant Relics, but he'd probably have to take a frontline item if that was the case, and that is not nearly as strong as trying to go for Radiant item on Deluxe. Lo and behold, he gets Buried Treasures and another offensive item here, Shojin, which he might slam, but he might play around it by getting a defensive item on Carousel, like a Redemption or a Vow. You can see how Lux 2 is still generating like plenty of damage here. No Dazzler, just 2 DM by herself, and she's still a reliable item holder, even in situations where you're not rerolling her. There's Lux on Carousel, which I think he's also fascinated by because she has a defensive item. So it's kind of like 2 birds with 1 stone, get you 1 step closer to a Lux 3 and get you a defensive item. Belt drops. Probably wants to think about defensive items. The best defensive item here is an adaptive helm. Might also be thinking about slamming a Shojin. Okay, Shojin here is because of late game value on things like Ziggs and Sona. Now he's getting the team builder online because he recognizes that he needs to go for the composition. So he's putting all the units. Set, Zac, Gragas, and Bruisers. Very nice. Notice that he's trying to scout and doesn't exactly have like the ideal Lux spot. In fact, if he wants to get like a good Lux angle, he probably has to move her towards the bottom left because a lot of people are angled to the top right. Even if you move Lux just a little bit over to the left, you end up probably getting value. But it looks like a lot of boards are a little bit on the weaker side, and Lux should still be able to target things like this Corki. Look at that, a 1-shot on Corki. And that's just Lux 2, man. Imagine if it was Lux 3. Any unit that's not immediately 2-starred is going to get destroyed. March of Progress allows us to save infinite gold. And now we're off to the races. Gragas 2. And we're just going to roll a bunch of gold here. Hits a Sona and a Lucian on 7. Wow. This guy is a high roller. Okay, he doesn't buy Sona. That's a little bit greedy. Wow. I guess at the same time, he's probably going to go for a bunch of 3-stars, so he doesn't have bench space for it. He'd rather just prioritize like one thing at a time. So he's thinking Lucian plus Jazz is probably better than Sona without Lulu. And also, he is probably like dizzy because he has to roll like a ton of gold. He only rolled to 82. There's a lot going on. He didn't even get to position in time. And he also kept his KDA position. This is one of the hardest things about the comp is that you just have to roll. So I'd probably recommend rolling even during the creep rounds. Martyr is really, really good. Remember, unit Roots is also really good. Just really good options in general. He put his defensive items onto a Set, by the way. And that is pretty logical because Set is probably the tankiest unit that he can hit. But I'm actually starting to think that he's not going to hit Set 2. So if he does find a replacement Set... Oh, he does? Actually, never mind. But he's also kind of in the spot where he is on Set 1. So if he somehow hits like Gragas 3, maybe we just put the items on Gragas instead. It's just whoever's tankiest. Okay, we're rolling more. And he made a Hand of Justice, has a Gragas 3, so Gragas 3 is going to take the items instead. That all makes sense. And Adaptive puts items on Jax because he knows if he goes for Jax 3, he can go for max power. So in that matchup, when you go up against a bunch of melee carries and whatnot, you can try to play around Jax if you want, but reality is Lux is still vulnerable to things like Akali without an extra Dazzler. This is kind of the downside of trying to play around Zed and 5 EDM versus another Dazzler on 7. Is that you don't have an extra Dazzler to bait. Now has JG slammed onto the Jax off the carousel. And now we hit Lux 3, just at the position for the right matchups. And now he's going bottom left for top right. This is a Twisted Fate 1. He should instantly die. Boom. Well, almost. And there it is. And without Twisted Fate, we lose most of our DPS. And Lux will clean up the rest. I believe so. And you can see how, like, you know, more units into surviving. But without their DPS units, they can't actually kill things like the Gragas. Just that's why it's really important to have a good front line. Because if those units enclose the Lux, we would have been in trouble. At level 8, we're definitely going to tag in another Dazzler of some kind. I wish we held one. That is probably one way we can optimize this. He positions in the bottom right, which ends up actually targeting the Twisted Fate anyways. So this ends up being okay. The way Disco players can play around this is to tech something in the other opposite corner from the Twisted Fate. Finds a Sona, which can be pretty good, but we really do want that Dazzler. And right now, we can just make do with any Dazzler for the most part. We make a Z2. We can actually start putting Z items as well if we want, because we have so many excess items. Edge of Night, Sunfire Cape. Actually, I just realized we don't have anti-heals, so Sunfire Cape ends up being really, really clutch. There's so many people playing Disco in this lobby, and again, if we position in the bottom left, we would have been able to farm all these Discos players, because all the Disco players naturally want to clump in the top right because their top right is our bottom left. They get maximum Disco value, so the Lux should be trying to prioritize that. The reason why he puts Lux in the bottom right is because it minimizes the amount of surface area for people to be able to get to the Lux. She only has 2 hexes that people can attack her from, versus in the bottom left, there are 3. And so now he decides to move to the bottom left, ends up angling on a Vex 3, which is really big. Killing Vex 3 is huge. And now we lost like half DPS on the other side. And now we work onto the Twitch, and boom, just like that. Another backline carry comp down. And now he's kind of clear to just kind of roll for everything 3-star. The only thing about it is that he wants to go to 9, but he can't because he's playing March of Progress. Another matchup where, you know, they have Samira 3 in the corner, and guess what? Pew pew. Oh my god, that Jackson is doing a lot of damage as well. And that person's dead. On Carousel, can start also itemizing the Zed. Runin is actually really good. Can also go for more frontline items like Redemption because we're playing Bruisers. Having 3-item Zac is also really good. Dude, he's smiling so much and giggling because he just knows that everyone's so pissed going up against him. He's rolling a lot here, probably to kind of go for Jax 3. I don't know if I necessarily agree with rolling full on here because he's so healthy and he could actually like slow roll to potentially go for things even like Z3. But that doesn't really matter. He's so far ahead at the moment. And I understand like why he wanted to roll because he wanted to put pressure on the rest of the lobby and kind of secure his placements. Actually, a lot of people's HP are kind of low, so I can kind of see that. Like, try to see if he can end the game here. Like, Jax 3 is a really big deal if he's able to hit. We get a Dazzler in finally. Lux fake to the right, goes to the bottom left. Did end up getting Giga Shrouded, so kind of want to position around that. But yeah, even if they have a Lowy, like, we're just so far ahead that we were deleting things like the tentacles and then just going down the middle and killing the carries. Like, people are trying to position around this Lux now, but they can't really do it effectively. Third item for Zac, probably. Warmogs makes sense here. Also gone Adaptive Helm, but Bruisers end up using extra HP really effectively, and he's playing Martyr. Everyone playing backline carries, no threat to our Lux whatsoever. Bottom right this time. Actually, interesting left. I think it would have been better if it was in the bottom left, because we would have killed the Ziggs first. Actually, no, there's an Edge of Night, so maybe this ends up being better. Oh, kind of close. We're almost at 9, so we had to think about what we're going to play at 9, and usually it's a Jazz unit to help give you some extra stats when you play a Bard, or you could try to see if you can tech in things like Sona Lulu. Disco is largely pretty useless here at this point. Goes up against the Ghost. This should be a pretty easy win. People are tucking like their Vex 3 and Twitch towards the center. Shouldn't be a problem. Easy Ghost win. And now we're at 9. We're rolling. See if we can top out with something really powerful. There's the Lucian for the Jazz. And our final boss is Twin Terror 3, Vex 3, Twitch 3. You know, just the best comp in the game. But, I mean, if you can't keep your Vex and Twitch alive, then does it even really matter? Wait. Oh my gosh. Actually, so close. Kind of lacking a little bit of damage now. Maybe a second item for Zed. Goes for Hodge. Deathplay is also acceptable for Zed just because he likes a lot of flat AD for the same reasons that Lux likes flat AP. I wonder if he actually would want to keep Jax alive. This could be something that you also think about positioning differently. I like that he also teched in a Kiana to potentially help swing a fight just in case the crowd diver damage ends up being relevant. Lux trying to see if she can target the Vex. Target the Vex, please. And nice. Boom. And just like that, taking down the best comp in the game. Nice job, Subzeroark. And nice job, Lux. This is the first episode of TFT Academy, where we break down comp guides and kind of walk you through the lessons on how to get some of these comps online and running. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below if I missed anything or you want further inclusions. Make sure you guys like and subscribe and engage in the content. That helps a lot with the algorithm. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace.